Okay, welcome everyone. I'm John Haig. I am the co-director of the Mossavar Rahmani Center for Business and Government. I want to welcome everybody. We have a fairly large number of people online. That's terrific. We are fortunate today. The topic today is delivering on net zero and UK energy. Chris Skidmore is going to lead us through a little bit of background about Chris. He's been a member of Parliament near Bristol and a former minister attending cabinet who has served across 4 departments of the UK government. He was appointed to the Privy Council in November of 2019. Most recently, he has twice served as Minister of State for Universities, Research, Innovation and Skills. And most importantly for this discussion, in 2019, he was appointed Interim Energy and Climate Change Minister attending cabinet. And in particular, and some of you may have seen Chris in earlier sessions, but he signed the US commitment to achieve net zero carbon emissions into law by 2050 and helped to secure the UK's bid to host the UN COP26 conference that took place in Glasgow last November. And there are various other things. He is a writer. I was interested in finding out. He's an historian writing on Tudor and medieval history. I'm sure there are some lessons that we can all learn from that period and apply today. We are also incredibly fortunate to have Kwasi Kwarteng with us. And I'll let Chris introduce Kwasi, but I want to thank both of our guests. The most important thing I actually should mention about Chris is he is now a senior fellow at the Mossavar Rahmani Center here at the Kennedy School. So with that, Chris, I will turn it over to you and to Kwasi. And I just want to especially say, Kwasi, thank you for joining us. I know your schedule's a little crazy.
Thank you.
Real quickly, for those of you, we will try to leave a little time at the end. Kwasi has a hard stop at a quarter till. But we will try to leave some questions towards the end, open questions for the end. You'll need to raise or you'll need to put your question into the Q&A function on the Zoom screen. So with that, Chris, it's all yours.
Thanks, John, and thanks also again to the Kennedy School for the opportunity to be a senior fellow here. And I'm looking forward to following this seminar, hosting a study group at 4 o'clock today to reflect on the events that we're about to have, and that'll be taking place in Taubman 401 between 4 p.m. and 5:30. And I look forward to meeting anyone who wants to come along and have a discussion there. It'd be great to meet you. It's my privilege to be able to introduce our speaker and panelists for the discussion today on delivering net zero and UK energy. The Right Honourable Kwasi Kwarteng MP has been a member of Parliament like myself since 2010, and he's served in the UK government both as Energy Minister and now as Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. And Kwasi has been tasked with the unenviable situation of having to not only deliver on the UK's commitment for net zero, and obviously we're going to be talking about that later, about how important that is for decarbonisation, post obviously the sort of UN IPCC report that was published yesterday, but also looking at energy security in light of the Ukraine war. And this week is a really key week for the UK, because Kwasi will be publishing the energy security strategy. I don't want to take words out of his mouth. Kwasi's going to speak for around about sort of 8 minutes, and then I'll ask a couple of questions before opening up some questions, which I will read out. So if you've got questions, put them in the Q&A box, and I will be able to pick them. But Kwasi, thank you so much for coming along to this seminar today. I'll hand the floor over to you.
Thank you very much. I hope you all can hear me. But thank you, everybody. Thanks to my friend, colleague and senior fellow, Chris Skidmore. Thank you, Chris, for inviting me today. Chris and I once co-authored a small little known book together called Britannia Unchained. This was published in 2012, before Brexit, before net zero targets and COVID-19. And the role of the state has changed dramatically since then. There is one lesson, however, that is still true today as it was then. And that's the need to unleash the power of competition, innovation, and private enterprise within a free market economy. From offshore wind to battery technology, the private sector has developed and deployed incredible technology that will change our lives for the better. The way to decarbonize isn't through a planned economy, but through the British way, through science, through innovation powered on by free enterprise. We understand the power of our precious free market economy to leverage private capital and unleash Britain's unique entrepreneurial spirit to grow new industries. This is how we will deliver net zero by 2050, working in partnership with business, with science, and with academia. However, there is a more immediate issue the international community is grappling with today. In light of rising global energy prices provoked by surging demand after COVID, as well as Russia's criminal invasion of Ukraine, there is a renewed focus by national governments on energy security and clean energy independence. The wholesale price of gas on the European market has increased by 500% in just 6 months, so much so that almost every renewable technology is now cheaper. If it isn't clear enough already, net zero is the solution to the global energy crisis, not the cause. Expensive gas is the problem. Cheap, clean, homegrown energy is the solution. Transforming our energy system is no longer just about hitting net zero targets and tackling climate change, as important as they are. It is also about national security. Putin's invasion of Ukraine has focused the minds of the international community on the urgent, insistent need to diversify away from Russian oil and gas and generate more power domestically. And even those countries that are not physically dependent on Russian hydrocarbons, like the United Kingdom, we are still vulnerable to prices that are dictated by global markets, heavily influenced by Russia. And this, of course, ratchets up costs for UK consumers. For as long as we depend on oil and gas, wherever it is from, we are all vulnerable to President Putin's malign influence on global markets. To diminish that malign influence, we not only need to phase out Russian fossil fuels, but we should also look to domestic sources of energy as well. And with gas prices at record highs and the price of renewable energy plummeting, we need to accelerate our transition away from expensive gas. Now, this week, the UK government will set out a new energy security strategy to supercharge cheap renewables and new nuclear power, while continuing support for our North Sea oil and gas industry. While international events give a new sense of urgency, the energy transition has always been a priority for the UK. We're not reinventing the wheel here. The UK has always been aware that we need to decarbonize and generate more cheap, clean power at home to reduce our exposure to global gas markets, which we have been unable to control. We were the first major economy in the world to legislate for net zero, a commitment that Chris signed as a minister. And we've also cut CO2 emissions further and faster than any other G7 country. We've expanded renewable energy generation by 500% in the last 10 years. Thanks to our competitive and soon-to-be annual renewable energy auctions, the price of supporting offshore wind has fallen by 70%, while production has increased dramatically. We're going to replicate this success in other areas, such as solar power, tidal power, and hydrogen, the new super fuel of tomorrow. Importantly, however, we also need a reliable source of low carbon baseload when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow. That has to be nuclear energy. Most of Britain's nuclear fleet will be decommissioned in the 2020s, this decade. We need to replace what we're losing and go further from large scale plants to small modular reactors. And this week's energy security strategy will reverse 30 years of failing to take the big decisions to generate more nuclear power. However, the transition to clean homegrown energy cannot happen overnight. It remains the case that there will continue to be an ongoing demand for oil and gas over the coming decades while we transition to clean energy. So in the meantime, we want to maximize domestic production in the North Sea to protect jobs and reduce reliance on imports. The Industrial Revolution began here in the UK before spreading to the US, to Germany, and the rest of the world. We're on the cusp of another revolution, a green industrial revolution. The countries that develop the tech of tomorrow will also lead future global markets for many years to come. If the West doesn't lead this global race, we will become even more exposed and vulnerable to forces we cannot control. We would import even more energy and technology from other countries and be exposed to excessive price fluctuations. Old industries that have failed to innovate will disappear. Jobs will be lost, and the burden on the taxpayer will become unbearable. We need to work together to lead this race for clean energy independence for our citizens. So whether you're in Cambridge, Massachusetts, or in Cambridge, England, the question of how we meet our growing energy needs is a matter of the greatest importance. The transition will only be a success if capable, energized, bright people like yourselves take an interest, as you're doing, in these issues. So thank you all very much for listening today. I'm very happy to take questions. As was observed, I'm in quite a tight schedule, but it's always a delight, even virtually, to come back to Harvard, where in fact I spent a year 25 years ago as a student, and I'm very happy to be addressing you today. So thank you.
Thank you, Kwasi, for that overview of UK energy policy, and also really appreciate that rallying cry to students involved in public policy to look at how they can be involved themselves in the energy transition process. I know that climate policy is a priority for the Harvard Kennedy School, and many students take a great deal of interest in it.
Absolutely.
I wanted to ask, in terms of the UK's sort of priorities, you mentioned that we became the first G7 country to sign net zero into law, and we have, I think, one of the most ambitious national determined contributions as part of that UN COP process for 2030. Why has the UK made the energy transition such a key priority for it? Is this a sort of post-Brexit narrative that the UK wants to establish itself as a first mover or world leader when it comes to looking at renewable energy sources for the future?
Well, I think that's a great question. I don't think it's related to Brexit. I mean, you and I have been in this parliament for 12 years now. And you'll also remember that the first Climate Change Act came in 2008, a full 8 years before Brexit. And you'll remember that in that legislation, I think the target was an 80% reduction in carbon emissions by 2050. Now, what's happened subsequent to that? We had the 2008 crash. We had a world where we tried to get the global economy back on its feet. But very frankly, we didn't actually address in those years the challenge of climate change. There was a keen focus on trying to get the economy back on track, but we didn't really think about the challenge of climate change and carbon emissions enough, perhaps. So what happened was that we passed, and I think you signed into law, the Net Zero Act in 2019. But I see that act very much, or the net zero legislation rather, I see that legislation very much as a follow-up from the work that had been done really 20, 30 years before that. And as a consequence of that, we've got to a position where we're reducing In the UK, we've reduced carbon emissions by 45% nearly, while we've grown the economy between 1990 and 2019 by about 78%. So it's a real commitment, but I think it's something that's been in gestation. It's been happening over many years now. And we're doing, very lastly to the point, because it's a very fundamental question. We've managed to really widen the engagement on net zero, along with allies. So I remember when I was made energy minister, when you were in the department as well, 3 years ago, we were practically the only country that had made a commitment, any kind of commitment, let alone legislative commitment, to net zero. I remember in 2020, we had China committing to net zero by 2060. People said to me that would never happen. We've had India committed to net zero by 2070. We want to encourage that transition, but they're committed to a date. And we've had all sorts of other countries, people around the world, committing to the 2050 date, as the Japanese have done, the South Koreans as well, and also the EU. So it's been a really impressive journey, I think, and many countries are behind us and are working with us to try and affect that change.
In terms of COP26 and obviously the commitments that were made last year, so the UK still holds the presidency for COP at least until Egypt in November. Should we be adapting our sort of net zero strategies and commitments given the geopolitical situation at the moment? Should there be flex within the net zero targets, or is it important that we stay a course towards that renewable economy you've mentioned?
I think that's an excellent question, and people ask it frequently. My own view and the government's view is that we do not need to change the targets. The targets are there, but we can be more flexible if we look at things like energy efficiency. I think that's one way we could expedite things. I think we need to look at a greater diversity of energy sources, and we are looking at policies. But the targets, I think, are very much set in stone. I mean, and you will remember this. In the UK, we have a CCC, and they have carbon budgets for 5-year periods. And it's my job as Secretary of State to try and make sure that we hit them. And I think we're on course. I think it's challenging, but we're not. There's no sense or indication that we're shifting the goalposts. We're still flexible, but we're still maintaining the targets we've set ourselves.
And you've mentioned energy security, and obviously we've touched on the Ukraine war and the rising cost of gas. How do you think we should sort of deal with this issue? Again, I know I can't prejudge what's going to be in your energy security strategy later this week, but what particular forms of home-owned energy should the UK seek to be prioritising for the future? And is there, I think, sort of opportunities to look at how we can roll out some of these technologies faster? I mean, Robert Price has asked in the chat box, what can the government do in areas like planning and grid connection to encourage greater rollout of technologies such as solar power, for example?
Look, those are great questions, and I don't want to anticipate or prejudge what will be in the strategy when it's published. But clearly, I think the diversity of energy sources that we have in the UK, I think, is a source of great strength. It's actually quite unusual. I mean, if I speak to French colleagues, 70% of their electricity generation is through nuclear. And Germany, until very recently, it has been very reliant on gas, which we all know about, 55% of which comes from Russia. And it's been historically reliant on coal. In the UK, I think we're lucky in that we've had a really wide diversity of energy sources. We've got natural gas, we've got offshore wind, we've got some nuclear, we've got solar power, we're looking at hydrogen. There's a whole range of energy vectors, if you like, that we're seeking to develop. And I think that's a sign of a really strong and resilient system, and one which is secure, because most of those technologies, the wind, solar power, nuclear power, these are all homegrown sources of power, and gives us a measure, a considerable measure, I think, of security. Now, the question that Robert, I didn't see the chat, but made in relation to offshore transmission networks, that's something we're looking at. I think that'll make a more efficient energy distribution system, and also looking at what we can do with the grid here in the UK. I mean, things like the gas grid, and that's where hydrogen and other infrastructure investment, I think, is really needed, and that's where we're looking to develop.
Another question from Frederick Daly, who asks about how can we do more in the UK to mitigate emissions. So thinking about that demand side rather than the supply side here, where do you think the priorities should lie around helping to address questions on demand reduction for energy usage? I think the total amount of electricity is set to double anyway by 2050, right. Simply we have a growing economy. But where do you think the key strategy should be for looking at that, whether it's on energy efficiency measures or whether it's on behaviour change? Really keen to get a sense of where you think the priority should lie.
That's a great question, and I think that in many ways the question of energy supply and decarbonising that is complicated and extensive though it is actually the simpler question to solve, simpler problem to solve than that of the demand side. And on the demand side, you're looking at buildings, you're looking at the decarbonisation of homes, you're looking at the decarbonisation of the public sector. You're using it. You're looking at people doing things. For example, the 10-point plan, the Prime Minister's 10-point plan. One of the points was about using public transport and walking, and so there's some behavioural change as well involved in that. My own view is that we should look to decarbonise homes, and we've done so. We've put billions of pounds into things like decarbonising the public sector, and I think public sector buildings, and I think there's more we can do in looking at energy efficiency. Now, one of the big bets, which actually combines supply and demand, because it's a completely new vector, is hydrogen. I think there'll be lots of uses for hydrogen, and if we get the hydrogen economy going, there's no reason why we can't essentially use it in the gas grid. But also, it will have demand. There'll be hydrogen demand in all sorts of other areas, not just in heating homes, but also in industrial processes, in transport, heavy goods vehicles, particularly, and trains. So hydrogen is a very good example of how the demand sort of innovation can meet supply and demand and change the nature of demand as well.
Excellent. Well, we've got two questions from Ely Sandler, who's asked about once Article 6 had been sort of signed off at COP26, which I thought was a fantastic, long overdue achievement. This international trade in potentially carbon and carbon emissions, it's been stated that the UK government wants to make London a global hub in carbon trading. And Eli wonders whether you had any sort of thoughts about how we can achieve this, and where will the opportunities lie for potentially looking at how to use Article 6 and international carbon trading mechanisms to reduce emissions.
I think the area of green finance, which Article 6 is all about, really, in the COP26, is one of the great opportunities of the whole net zero process. The way in which, even in my time as an energy minister or secretary of state in 3 years, the way in which the city is talking about green finance, the fact that we launched the first green sovereign bond, I think it was in 2020 actually, all of these things open up a whole area of green finance in which London is very keen to play its part. Only yesterday I was speaking at a fintech conference, and people were very focused on this idea that London, which for centuries has been a centre of global finance, of capital raising, of expertise, is very keen to be involved in financing the transition. And I think it's a huge opportunity. And it's something which the government has taken very seriously, not only through the Treasury, launch of green sovereign bonds, but also in having mandatory TCFDs, which Rishi Sunak announced only a little more than a year ago.
Now, you mentioned the need to look, in these insecure times, at every source of energy as part of the transition, which it is, and obviously the UK still needs to use gas as part of that sort of long-term transition towards renewables. I think for those from the States, very familiar with fracking in America and the opportunities it has presented. Obviously, in the UK, there are a number of politicians who are interested in exploring forms of gas extraction from shale. Is this a serious approach that the UK government wants to look at, and how can it be reconciled with our sort of net zero commitments for the future?
I'll just say three things about this. I think in a world where gas prices are as high as they are, in a world where Putin is essentially trying to dictate and shape the gas market, many colleagues, our colleagues, Chris, would say, well, why don't we look again at the trillions of cubic meters of gas that are underneath our feet here in the UK? And I think it's fair enough, as we have done, to say we're willing to look at this again. Absolutely. I'd say two more things to that. So that's the first thing. I think it's a fair question, and that's something that we're happy to do. The second point I want to make is that there is no way that we can do this without a large measure of community consent. That's always been a principle, and there's no way we can do it unless if it isn't safe. And that's always been our position. That was the position when we announced the moratorium in 2019, and that still is our position. But I think it's a fair thing to look at this. And then the last thing I would say is that I think that there are conditions in places in America which lend itself to fracking. England, Britain is a much more densely populated country, and there are challenges to that. And so that's why community consent is very important.
Just on that issue of community consent, and I think maybe some of those watching from the States won't be aware, but obviously every country has its own sort of peculiar energy priorities. You've mentioned France with nuclear, obviously being the diametrically opposed situation to Germany. Obviously our sort of peculiarity is that there was this moratorium placed on onshore wind back in 2012. So no new wind farms onshore. We've had sort of huge success offshore in the North Sea. If we're looking at sort of whether it's fracking, whether it's onshore wind farms, whether it's small modular nuclear power plants for the future, I mean, this is a question I'm grappling here with at the Kennedy School, which is how do we sort of deal with opposition? Have you got any thoughts about how to look at incentive, how we can create those opportunities for communities to see how they can, back certain forms of energy supply?
I think you're right. I think getting people on side when we're talking about large infrastructure projects is really important, and even offshore wind. People have interests and concerns about how we get the cables, what the substations look like, where the electricity power is landed. There are all sorts of planning issues related to energy infrastructure, and there are ways in which we want to seek agreement. I think a lot of the reason why we've had success in things like offshore wind, and the onshore wind moratorium was in, I think, 2015, and it was specifically about the CFD auction. So what was called the Pot 1 auction, which was onshore wind and solar, was suspended. We've reopened that, but we're very clear that we can't do this without a huge measure of local consent. Now, I think that there are different ways one can incentivize this. One big way, and what people see, is that it creates jobs, it creates opportunity. Whenever I go to offshore wind installations in Teesside or off the coast of Aberdeen or off the coast of Suffolk in England, I'm always struck by the number of apprentices I see, young people in their late teens, early 20s, who are really energized by the prospects of having, decades-long careers in these industries, in these growing, these nascent industries. The other group of people I see quite a bit of are people who've spent a lot of time in the North Sea. They've spent 15, 20 years sometimes working on North Sea rigs, but they've readapted those skills, those marine engineering skills, those physical skills, if you like. They've readapted those to working on offshore wind. So it's a really good opportunity, the new technologies, to not only provide jobs, but also reskill an existing workforce. I think it's the green jobs agenda is enormous.
Actually, to follow on the jobs point, I mean, I know locally where I am, we have Hinkley, and that supports up to, I think, 30,000 jobs, new
And I'll
nuclear.
be going to Hinkley, I think, tomorrow, in fact.
Oh, excellent.
So I look forward to it. It's I think my third or fourth time there. So there we go. But who knows? Let's see.
I think that sort of jobs ecosystem that can be potentially created is another really exciting opportunities for nuclear. And then you touched on nuclear. You're very strident of saying, you want to overturn 30 years of decline. Would you want to sort of give a bit of a sense of the landscape that might be the opportunity in the UK? Because I think we've got the sort of existing larger fleet of potentially Sizewell C, but then small modular nuclear reactors. How will this sort of be different, do you think, in the UK than elsewhere?
So the history of nuclear, I'm sure, I mean, you might even get around to writing a book of this. I think it's one of the most interesting things, actually, in the whole energy space. If you look at turn the clock back to the 50s and 60s, in the UK, we have the best, arguably the best, the most advanced civil nuclear rollout investment of any major country. We went big on civil nuclear in the 50s, and that went through, was carried through in the 60s, which means that today we've got about 25 sites where there are mostly old nuclear power stations. Now, in the UK, in the 1960s, late 60s, but particularly in the 70s, we discovered a huge wealth of North Sea oil and gas assets. And we turned to that as a big source of power. And as a consequence of that, nuclear deployment, investment in nuclear really waned. But we still have those 25 sites, historic sites. Some of them, most of them are going to come off stream. They're not going to produce any power. And so the challenge really is to try and reinvigorate some of them. And that's what the debate around, or rather the progress we've seen in Hinkley Point C is all about. There's a whole debate and I think there's action on Sizewell C. And I think some of those sites, places like Wilfer and other places, Hartlepool, there's a site there. These are places which in the not too distant future can have an upgraded nuclear power plant. And the great advantage of that is that these are communities, areas which are used to the technology, which have skills, which have a tradition of it. And it's a question of upscaling. Now, you mentioned SMRs, and we've taken the view very much that we want to see large-scale nuclear, some increased large-scale nuclear, but also SMRs as well, which are small modular reactors. And the view that I had, and I was part of that debate in 2020, was that you can't have a fleet of SMRs, or you can't have an SMR program without having skills in your country, in the UK, that can deliver the program. So you need nuclear technicians, nuclear engineers to work on the SMR program. And looking into this, it was very apparent that those skills could only really be derived from existing nuclear power stations. So you had to have, in order to have SMRs, you do have to have large scale as well, where people can learn about, very difficult nuclear physics, nuclear engineering, and apply those skills to a small modular fleet. So a small modular reactor fleet. So very much part of our strategy, nuclear strategy, the core of our strategy is a focus on both large-scale nuclear and SMRs.
The IPCC report that came out yesterday, apart from highlighting the the risk to 1.5 degrees warming pathway was that we can't do this now without some form of carbon capture mechanism, whether that's CCUS or direct air capture. Now, the UK is obviously, I think there's great interest in the UK's net zero industrial hubs as a potential sort of pilot opportunity for looking at how we can use carbon capture. Would you be able to give a sort of sense of how these are sort of being set up and their operation?
This is a really good question. And actually, what I'm trying to stress here is the fact that none of this stuff has come in a vacuum. There's a history, there's a backstory to this, which I think needs to be spelled out. We've been talking about carbon capture for at least 15 years. There was a commitment, I think, in 2007-8 to carbon capture. You and I, Chris, will remember there were commitments to Peterhead, having carbon capture in Peterhead. I think in the 2015 budget, there was initially £1 billion committed to it. But of course, you will remember that the budget had to be essentially adapted because of the fact that we couldn't get a parliamentary majority for tax credit reform. And as a consequence of that, the £1 billion committed to carbon capture had to be reassigned effectively at the last minute. When I was made Energy Minister in 2019, July, one of the first conversations I had was all about carbon capture. We'd had 2 bites of the cherry on it, and we hadn't got anywhere. And the question that posed itself was, how committed are we to carbon capture? I think we've proved, actually, over the last 3 years that we're very committed to it. We committed 800 million in the 2019 manifesto. That was committed in the budget, the follow in 2020. We've had the 10-point plan, which came out at the end of 2020, and we recommitted it to carbon capture there. And only last year we ran essentially a competition for these 2 sites that you referred to, where they are big industrial clusters, where we wanted to see carbon capture happen, and we've announced those sites as one in the Teesside Humber side, Teesside Humber Corporation. There's a big field called Endurance where we can capture huge amounts of carbon dioxide, and also we've allocated HyNet a place on that first phase. So, and very soon, I think we'll be publishing business models, investable, giving an investable proposition, and doing what I always say is the key. And I said in my opening remarks, is the key to progress in this. We're essentially going to support a structure which will attract and incentivize private sector investment. And I think that over the next 4 or 5 years, one of the great successes, I hope, of the Department of the UK as well, will be investment serious investment in hydrogen production, both blue and green, and also in carbon capture, centered, as you pointed out, around those 2 industrial clusters.
Kwasi, thank you so much. I'm going to hand the final question for the session back over to our director, John Haigh. John, you coming online? Yeah, excellent. John,
Brilliant. Hi, John.
Question. Hi, Kwasi. So thank you so much for taking the time. Carbon has a unique kind of characteristic in that once it's in the environment, it stays, right? Yeah. And so you've got a stock problem and a flow problem. And basically net zero really addresses the flow problem to some extent. So if you think, assume for the moment that we're, as a globe, we're successful about reaching net zero 2050. And then the question is, what do we do about the existing stock of carbon that's in the environment that will still affect the climate and drive global warming? So how do you feel, how does the government feel about kind of extreme technologies? I don't think, for example, solar geoengineering, that is clearly not in a position where it could be utilized today. There's clearly kind of much that has to be done, but there's been some opposition to even doing research on global solar geoengineering. Do you have a perspective on that?
No, I don't know whether there's no reason why you should have seen this. I mean, I've been quite positive about that. I think there are opportunities in space which definitely should be explored. And in terms of the existing carbon, I mean, you very neatly distinguish between the flow and the stock, and I totally get that. But, I should have, it was relevant to the last question. At
Right.
COP26,
Right.
the Prime Minister and with Bill Gates announced hundreds of millions to direct air capture, investing in research and carbon capture from the air. And that's something which, again, is a very nascent technology. I believe they do it in Switzerland. It's very expensive, but with the right investment and the right incentives, there's no reason why we can't actually accelerate that and deal, as you put it, with the stock of carbon already in the atmosphere.
Yeah, without advertising for one of our faculty members, David Keith has actually founded one of the original carbon capture companies that seems to be doing quite well, and is funded.
I love it. I love the way at Harvard we can always marry business with academia. It's fantastic. I've always been impressed with the way you do that.
Kwasi, I could say thank you so much for attending. I realize you've got to rush off to another meeting.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here. As I said, the last time I went to a lecture in the K School was probably about 1997. But it's really good to be back, even if it's only virtual. So thank you.
Well, I'm sure the school will provide an in-person invitation eventually.
I wasn't angling for it, but thank you. It's really good to see you again, and very good to see you, Chris.
Excellent. Well, for those students on the call still to say, I've still got the study group at 4 p.m. in Taubman 401 to reflect on some of the points raised in this conversation. And then also another study group tomorrow, if anyone's still up for it, again at 4 p.m. in the Elwood Democracy Lab, which I will be covering net zero strategies and delivering against popular opposition and unknowable events, which obviously we did sort of touch on today also. But thank you from me, and I'll hand back to John now just to close the session.
I have nothing to add other than to simply say thank you all for coming. I hope you found it enjoyable. I'd like to thank Claire and Victoria for making it all, and Dan, obviously, for making it all work so smoothly. So thanks to all of you. Enjoy the rest of the day. Go to the study groups. Thanks.